Hello, friends. Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Welcome. Uh, as, actually, yesterday, uh, the topics which we have covered, some of the participants was asking just now about some of the questions. In fact, that is regarding rights, then directive principles of state policy. Then also we can expect questions as to what is the and the source of the constitution, then the nature of the preamble and how the preamble reflects the very nature of our polity, Indian polity. And once you go to the texts, you shall also find some of the questions which are following the text itself. So these are the possible angles from which the questions can be put and all that. For example, what are group rights? What are individual rights? What are the points of distinction between directives and fundamental right and all that? In fact, today I shall go to throw some light on the nature of our polity. ଆପଣମାନେ ସମସ୍ତେ ଗୋଟେ popular rather slogan, unity in diversity. And we all know that whenever one example is asked, that we say that our nation, our country is one example of unity in diversity. So the next issue which we shall discuss is diversity and pluralism. And we can appreciate democracy only in the context of Indian pluralistic Indian society. So democracy in our country, in a very significant way, it was prefigured in the form of colonial legacy. The Britishers, they have introduced the representative legislative bodies with limited power. You must have gone through certain acts in your undergraduate stage and all that, like 1909 Act, which is usually known as Morley-Minto Act, then the Montego-Chelmsford Act of 1919, then also the Government of India Act 1935. But all these acts, they have bestowed upon the representative bodies very, very limited powers. And even though grant of the voting rights was limited in nature, ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଆକ୍ଟ ଗୁଡାକ ବ୍ରିଟିଶର୍ସ ମାନେ କରିଥିଲେ ସେଟା ମଧ୍ୟ ଭୋଟିଂ ରାଇଟ୍ ଟାକୁ ମଧ୍ୟ ବହୁତ ଲିମିଟେଡ ଇଲେକ୍ଟୋରେଟ୍ ଟାକୁ ବହୁତ ଲିମିଟେଡ ରଖିଥିଲେ. The groups who are accorded this political representation were very identified as religious communities with immutable interests and collective rights. So the political leadership of independent India, which was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, and others, they put emphasis over the responsibility of the nation state to recognize and to accommodate the enormous diversities in India, so that all the groups, all interests, all the sets of opinion, they can be represented. The pluralistic form of Indian democracy, in its procedural form, it has been evident in the form of federalism. जो समय हमारा independent India was formed or it was carved out, you must be knowing there are various problems, issues like language issue, religious issue, caste, class, creed, and all that. For example, this language issue. There is a three language policy on which the states were organized on the linguistic basis. For your information, probably Odisha was the first state which was organized on the basis of language. So language has served a very important parameter in the formation of states in independent India. So whether it is above reasons which explain the very nature and resilience of democracy in India, it remains an irrevocable fact that democracy remains deep rooted in India. And India continues to have its parliament, courts of law, rights of the people, and a free and independent press. And the greatest signifier of the success of Indian democracy, it has been in providing space for political contestation and in creating opportunities for assertion of varieties of claims. The claims which are articulated by various interest groups. Because India society is a very typical society which reflects various interest groups, and in the process, democratic politics has even begun to corrode the authority of the traditional social order in India. Because prior to independence in our traditional India, the society was hierarchical, but the parameters were different. We have a caste structure. Typically, ଆପଣ ଦେଖିବେ ଇଣ୍ଡିଆର society ଗୋଟେ caste hierarchy ଉପରେ ବେଶ କରିକି ଥିଲା. Starting from the Aryan days and all that, we have Varnashrama Dharma and all that. You must be knowing that how various Varnas or various caste groups, they have their own role to play. So, the very nature of democracy in India must be appreciated in the context of pluralism, the diversities. आम यदि पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी की आधार करी डेमोक्रेसी डिफाइन करिबा in the context of political theory, then democracy can be viewed as a form of good governance. I am not talking of Aristotle. Aristotle अपन जो मान idea थी वो, when he has classified forms of government, he has put democracy on the perverted side, not in the side of the enlightened governance. But that is an Aristotelian definition. It is not applicable to the present definition of democracy. Democracy is increasingly now viewed in form of a good governance. And what are the essential values of democracy? The moral value of the present day democratic state lies in arriving at consensus. Decisions which are supported, if not by consensus, but by the majority groups, the majority opinion. And the decisions which are taken in a democracy, they take every citizen's interest into account. And they are equally binding on everyone. Present democratic tradition में हमारा decision टा किन arrive होगी, mostly by majority voting. Not exactly, it is not consensus. କାରଣ କନସେନସସରେ ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ସେଟ୍ ଅଫ୍ ଓପିନିଅନ୍ ମାନଙ୍କର ଇମ୍ପୋର୍ଟାନ୍ସ ରହିବା ଆବଶ୍ୟକ, ବଟ୍ ଇଟ୍ସ ନଟ୍ ଦ କେସ୍. Mostly the decision is taken up by the majority support. ତେଣୁ ଅନେକ ଯୋଉମାନେ ଡେମୋକ୍ରାସିର କ୍ରିଟିକ୍ ସେମାନଙ୍କର ମତରେ not always the decisions taken in the democracy are serving the interest of every group of the society, but more or less the decisions they try to take into account the interest of all the groups. And the core principles which justify the democracy in case of this diversified societies or pluralistic societies like India are manifold. For example, gote principle hochi individuals are autonomous rational beings. Ame kahi individual gote rational being boli bhauche? Because every individual is capable of deciding what is good for him. प्रत्येक इंडिविजुअल ता पे कोटा भलो he can decide. So that is why every individual is a autonomous rational being. Second, all individuals should have equal say in the determination of collective decision. At least stage a core principle of democracy. किछि नहले मध्य till the election in a democratic polity is over, everybody has equal participation in the process of governance. We are not bothered about what happens in the post-electoral scenario and all that. You know, unanimity actually is not possible. आम जदि कहबा जे सब लोक गोटे डिसीजन रे एग्री करिवे, that is called unanimity. It is generally impossible to achieve. When collectivity makes an attempt to arrive at a commonly agreed upon decision, ସେଥିପାଇଁ ଦେଖିବା that ସବୁଠାରୁ plausible procedure in order to arrive at a commonly agreed decision is the principle of majority rule. एणु क्रिटिक जो माने डेमोक्रेसी से माने आपण माने भी जानिथिबे, in their opinion it is said जे गणतंत्र एमती गोटे पॉलिटी बा गोटे शासन जोथरे मेजॉरिटी ओपिनियन टाको माइनॉरिटी ऊपर लदी दिया जाउछ. So virtually decisions are taken by majority support. कारण unanimity something is something impossible. सब लोग जे गोटे डिसीजन को एग्री करिवे किछि माने नै. So the principle of majority rule, which is most practical and morally acceptable in a democracy, due to the large and complex societies, it is not possible to gather together to make decisions on every issue. सेटा गोटे डायरेक्ट डेमोक्रेसी रे पॉसिबल होता. फॉर एग्जांपल इन एथेंस, फॉर एग्जांपल हम बहुत पुराना समय रे डेमोक्रेटिक ग्रीक सिटी स्टेट रे प्रैक्टिस कराला. आपण माने सिटी स्टेट मांगरे धरंतु एथेंस, एथेनियन डेमोक्रेसी माने वेस्ट डेमोक्रेसी रे बहुत प्राचीनतम. All the citizens of the city state can gather together and can decide a particular case even with unanimity sometimes. But now it is not the case. एपरिकी प्रेजेंट डे मध्ये अनेक अनेक क्रिटिक्स बा स्कॉलर, फॉर एग्जांपल सीबी मैकफर्सन, जो मन तांकर ओपिनियन टा कोन से पढिथिबे, he has actually visualized the present day capitalistic democracies, that in this capitalistic democracies there is a participatory model of democracy. People participate in decision making, and modern democracy therefore works with a set of procedure and the representative institutions by which people can elect their representatives and hold them periodically accountable. Actually, आमे प्रेजेंट डेमोक्रेसी की मैक्सिमम सक्सेसफुल बोली कहीं चिंता करूचे जे अंततः आम लोक माने पार्टिसिपेट करूछन गोटे इलेक्टोरल प्रोसेस रे दे इलेक्ट ए पॉपुलर गवर्नमेंट एंड एटलीस्ट थियोरेटिकली द गवर्नमेंट पीरियडिकली अकाउंटेबल कारण हम इलेक्शन गुड़ा पीरियडिकल करा होछ धर 5 वर्ष पे हमें गोटे निर्दिष्ट पार्टी की गवर्नेंस को आले if the people are dissatisfied after that particular period is over they may be thrown out of the seat of power by the people. But in between, actually, the most of democracies they have no bridle of control like recall. अवश्य जो माने स्विट्जरलैंड रो डेमोक्रेसी विषय किछ अल्प बहुत जानते से मानकर कहे स्विट्जरलैंड हैज a direct democracy even today because they are practicing the methods of recall, referendum and initiative. But in case of India, this practice is not there. The practice of recall is not there. Even if you are dissatisfied with the person who is elected by you, you cannot call him back. So they are periodically accountable. You have to wait for the next election to overthrow a government. So आमे जदि इंडिया रो डेमोक्रेटिक ट्रेंड्स को आमे ऑब्जर्व करिबा the democracy is nothing but purely a set of institutions. गणतंत्र भितर किछि गुडे अनुष्ठान जड़ित होई रही चंती. And what are those institutions? Like free and fair election. प्रथम जिनस होछि निर्वाचन. हम जे गुटे गणतंत्र अछि हम प्रथम कुत्र जानु छे that we have a periodic election. We have legislative assemblies, parliament, then general legal framework and constitutional governments. Essentially, this is what is called procedural side of governance. These are the procedures through which the democratic objectives can be fulfilled. Procedural kahin kare dharantu election is a procedure through which we are electing our popular government. And you know, in this case, I can give some idea on two forms of democracies. One is this proceduralistic view of democracy, and the other one is substantive view of democracy. In proceduralistic view of democracy, the level of the electoral participation, the frequency of election and what is called the periodic elections, the peaceful change in the political power, they can be considered as indicators. But you know, some of the critics of this procedural form of governance, they say that this type of approach and view is endangered by the fallacy of electoralism as the social and economic inequality involving the ethno-cultural communities, which includes minorities, which includes women group and all that, which make it difficult for them to participate actively. Minority groups, for example, the women groups, sufficient arrangement, electoral arrangements other section of the society equally participate. So the critics say that sometimes this proceduralistic view could not or fails to do justice for these minorities so far as their participation is concerned in the process of democracy. Other side is substantive form of democracy. They argue that the procedural democracy is not enough. ଗଣତନ୍ତ୍ର କେବଳ ପ୍ରୋସିଜରାଲ ପାର୍ଟକୁ ଆମେ ଯଦି ଏମ୍ଫାସାଇଜ କରିବା that is not enough. Is it audible? Hello? Somebody says, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. जो माने सब्सटेंसिव फॉर्म ऑफ डेमोक्रेसी रे बेसी एम्फासाइज करंती, they argue that any democratic project is incomplete until the meaningful exercise of equal rights of citizenship they have been guaranteed to all. Substance is important. केवल प्रोसीजर फॉलो कर धरन गोटे इलेक्शन सक्सेसफुली कंडक्टेड, a government is formed, that's not enough. The equal rights of the citizens must be guaranteed. That is the substance of the democracy. Just on it, for example, I am telling you, there are many other things which on the substance also. So, on this account, free and fair election, freedom of speech and expression, the rule of law, and its protection to all are necessary. This is necessary. ये जो procedural part है, election is required. नॉले हमें government केमती form करिया, rule of law is required, but they are not sufficient conditions for successful democracy. एनु जो माने substantive democracy ଉପରେ गुरुत्व दियंती, they argue that even though the procedural side is needed, that is not enough. केवल जो गोटे लीगल और पॉलिटिकल इक्वालिटी के हमें सिक्योर कर दे प्रोसीजरली गोटे मीनिंगफुल डेमोक्रेसी के आनिमा, इट्स नॉट दैट, बिकॉज इन अ सोसाइटी लाइक इंडिया those procedures can be severely restricted by inequalities which deny many from having a truly equal opportunity to influence the government decisions. So remember, this is, I think you understand now. Procedural part is all right. किंतु procedural part को यदि केवल गुरुत्व देबा तबे हम एक सक्सेसफुल डेमोक्रेसी अराइव करि परिबा नाही, कारण हमर सोसाइटी रे social and other inequalities are so abundant, so preponderant, so influential that they can also restrict the opportunity to influence the government decisions. It is what can be termed as social agenda of democratization. You know, our contemporary post-industrial information society re, the concentration of the expert knowledge, it's symbolized by the exercising influence of public policy of the specialists, I mean devised by the specialists over government policy and public opinion, and that is also that constitutes another limitation. Another important development side by side with democracy is development. हमें 1990s ପରେ we have ushered into an era of globalization, and this present era of globalization is characterized by upcoming market economy. There is upsurge of market economy, and also the concept of political democracy. This market economy and political democracy, these are very important virtues in the present trend of democracy, and there are also necessities. You know, এটা পোস্ট কলোনিয়াল এশিয়ান कंट्रीज लाइक इंडिया हो कारण हमर इंडिया इज नथिंग बट ए पोस्ट कलोनियल स्टेट जोटा के आगु कॉलोनी थिले इंडिपेंडेंट हेजन दीज आर पोस्ट कलोनियल एशियन सोसाइटीज इंडिया इज वन ऑफ देम कि ईस्ट यूरोपियन पोस्ट कम्युनिस्ट सोसाइटी हंतु अफ्रीकन सोसाइटी हंतु लैटिन अमेरिकन सोसाइटीज हंतु कारण एमाने समस्त इंडिपेंडेंस को गोटे परवर्ती समय पाइछंती it may be Afro-Asian countries, post-colonial societies, or it may be Latin American societies. So, the theorists of political economy, they create a new branch by which the success of democracy can be emphasized, it can be measured. Some of the important thinkers of this line are, for example, Deepak Nair, and many others like him. They have drawn attention to the fact that there has always been a tension between the economics of market and politics of democracy. Very important observation. The political democracy trend as mark the market economy, that is the economics of the market, এবং politics of democracy ভিতরে সবବେଳେ ଗୋଟେ tension লাগিଛି ଅନ୍ତର୍ଦ୍ୱନ୍ଦ୍ୱ inherent tension is cropping up, and the very notion of the majoritarian democracy is preferable to monarchies or other oligarchies. It has been questioned on the basis that it leads to what I have already told you, tyranny of majority. कारण डेमोक्रेसी रो प्रेजेंट डे क्रिटिक माने tyranny of majority पर बारंबार they are harping it. एठी गोटे थियोरिटिकल गोटे फिलोसॉफिकल इंटरप्रिटेशन रुसोंकर आपनकर जो माने आईडिया थिबो रुसोंक ऊपर जे कि जनरल विल विषय कहिसंती जनरल विल only can serve common interest. Into general will is not necessarily will of all. It is not necessarily the majority will. Sometimes that can also lie in the opinion of a single person. So majority is not always right. At the same time, that the argument that markets protect the interest of the individual and the minorities is limited. It's not there. This very argument is not always sustainable. It has been argued that markets are nothing but the tyranny of the minority. Just you see interpretation. Market tagu अनेक view करते that is the tyranny of the minorities. Now in the market people vote with their money, whereas in the political democracy everyone has equal vote. Right to vote is equally given to every citizen in a democratic country. So this is how market economy and politics of democracy, there is internal. One thinks in terms of the tyranny of the majority, one thinks in terms of the tyranny of the minority. Market speaks of the tyranny of the minority. So there is inherent tension. So we can say that combination of democracy and markets is sufficient or say necessary to bring economic development of the masses. Can we conclude like this? If there is inherent tension between the two, can we conclude that the combination of democracy and markets is sufficient to bring economic development of the masses or of the people. Then what about the egalitarian developments in planned economies without political democracy? The examples have been taken in the countries like communistic states of East Europe or also in Southeast Asia. So we must understand that the markets they have a peculiar tendency of excluding the people as consumers. Because market re gote lokor identity ta kono? What is about the identity of a person in a market? He is a consumer. Markets also মানে গোটে যদি গোটে consumer if he has not sufficient income or any income for that matter, then what the markets will do? It shall tend to exclude him, a consumer, because he has no income. जोटाकि अमर्त्य सेन कहते entitlements. Markets also exclude the people as producers or sellers if they have neither assets nor capabilities. Capabilities ଭିତରେ ଆମେ example ମାନେ natural talent को ଗୋଟେ capability, skills acquired through teaching, learning, the skills acquired through experience, the skills acquired through education. All these constitute assets or capabilities. So, markets tend to exclude people as consumers, and also sometimes markets tend to exclude people as producers or sellers. So, economic exclusion further accentuates the social and political exclusion. The exclusion of a person economically leads to social exclusion. It leads to political exclusion and also finally economic and political deprivations. He is deprived. Moreover, the people devoid of entitlements or assets or capabilities, ଆମେ जो example गुड़ाक देले, capabilities ଭିତରେ natural talent, skills acquired through the teaching, skills through learning, skills through experience, education. So if the people they are devoid of the entitlements or assets, then can they assert their rights? So scholars like Mirza Gopal Jayal, they have concluded that there is an almost complete disengagement between the life's aspiration of the ordinary women on the one hand, and the world of the important national issues upon which are revolving around the interest of the advantaged on the other side. A theoretical interpretation ଆମେ କଣ ଗୋଟେ simple conclusion କରିପାରିବା that in the market economy, economic stratification is a must. Stratification अर्थात बुझुଛ layering of the society. ଆମର ଯେମିତି social stratification ଥିଲା, social hierarchies ଥିଲା, ସେମିତି economic stratification. In the market economy, economic stratification is a must. ଯୋଉଥିରେ କି କିଛି ଲୋକ ସିଷ୍ଟମ ସାଙ୍ଗରେ ଇଣ୍ଟିଗ୍ରେଟ ହେବେ କିଛି ଲୋକ ମାର୍ଜିନାଲାଇଜ ହେଇଯିବେ। So in such a situation, the institutional arrangements which they are instituted to mediate between the economic development on the one hand and social development on the other, they became critical. এই সিচুয়েশন কোন जो अनुष्ठान गुड़ा तैयारी होइछन गोटे डेमोक्रेटिक कॉन्टेक्स्ट रे जो मानकर काम होची आर्थिक विकास एवं सामाजिक विकास भितर मीडिएट करिबा, their function become very critical. If they could not function or they cannot negotiate or mediate properly, the economic growth in that particular society may lead to regional unevenness or class inequality. So, in this background, we can think in terms of the democracy and developments in the post-colonial societies. And India is one of them. I already said most of the African countries are post-colonial. Some are colonies for independence and Western counterpart trend. So far as these trends are concerned, they are distinct and different. Colonialism, for example, in our society, it has distorted the social, economic, and political structures. Our colonial rule gote bad victimize ame को दृष्टि our social, economic, and political structure गुड़ाक colonialism द्वारा ध्वस्त विध्वस्त होला. They have been distorted. So it follows that the very tools which are developed in the advanced capitalistic societies, they cannot be transposed in these societies. That explains the ongoing debate in democratic theory concerning the new democracies. So there has been a long debate as to whether democracy and development are compatible in the post-colonial states. You know, यहाँ भीतर गोटे सब तर्जमा चलला जे post-colonial society रे democracy और development से माने compatible कि नुहे. I mean, both the democracy and development, can they go together? Democracy and diversity, and democracy, state and civil society, these are the vital points of issue so far as the post-colonialistic society are concerned. In the first years of independence, the strategy of economic development was shaped by a political consensus. आमे जते स्वाधीनता पाइले हमरो प्रथम किछि वर्ष जो प्लानिंग हला ये हला हमरो इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट ऊपर आमे बेसी एम्फसाइज करले. से समय में इमीडिएटली नेहरूवियन मॉडल को एक्सेप्ट करले. नेहरू वाज आवर फर्स्ट प्राइम मिनिस्टर and there was a long term perspective in Nehruvian ideas India. You know, Nehru ko चिंता रे economic development for India was very much a dream for the Indians in the initial years of independence. And Congress accommodated the poor people under the rubric of socialism. I have already in the yesterday's class talked about Bombay Plan of 1944, that how the poor people, their economic development can be accommodated. And also the new industrial resolution of 1948. And the strategy is mostly, or the model is called Nehru Mahalanobis model, Indian state was to take responsibility for the provision of infrastructure as well as large and heavy industrial investment. So, democracy we have achieved, but it has never come to India as a response to an absolutistic state, nor as the realization of individualistic conception of society. There was a contrast to the experience in the advanced capitalistic liberal societies of the West. ନା ଆମର ଯୋଉ ଆଣ୍ଟି କଲୋନିଆଲ ଷ୍ଟ୍ରଗଲ ଚାଲିଥିଲା ବ୍ରିଟିଶର ମାନଙ୍କୁ ହଟେଇବାର ଯୋଉ ପ୍ରୟାସ ଚାଲିଥିଲା ଇଟ୍ ୱାଜ ବେଷ୍ଟ ମୋର ଅନ୍ ଦ ଡିମାଣ୍ଡ ଫର ଦ ଅଟୋନୋମସ୍ ସ୍ପେସ୍ ଫର ଦ ନେସନ ଦେନ୍ ଆବାଉଟ୍ ଇଣ୍ଡିଭିଜୁଆଲ ଫ୍ରିଡମ that was the basic thing जोटा कि वेस्टर्न डेमोक्रेसी रु हमर इंडियन डेमोक्रेसी को अलग करके रखला हमर जो एंटी कॉलोनियल स्ट्रगल्स था it was trying for a space for the independent nation not for the individual freedom and individual freedom ଉପରେ ବିଶେଷ emphasis କରା ଯାଇ ପାର ନଥିଲା. So Gandhian notion of a just state was premised on the idea that the collective interest must take precedence over the individual interest. And the nationalist leadership thought in terms of a democratic republic with the promises to secure justice, liberty, equality and fraternity. जो कि हमारा preamble रे a phrase रे लगा है justice, political, social, economic and political and all that which we had discussed yesterday. And universal franchise, सार्वजनिक भोट प्रथा, it was thus granted in one go in the predominantly agrarian society, which was lacking in terms of democratic consciousness. You know, today post-colonial society, जे कि immediate independence पाई in this above situation, the state had an important role to play as a mediator between political democracy and economic democracy. राजनैतिक गणतंत्र एवं अर्थनैतिक गणतंत्र भितर गोटे मेडिएशन गोटे सुस्थ गोटे हेल्दी कनेक्टिविटी की आनिमा रो दायित्व आम स्टेट रो रहिला. इट हैज ए इंपोर्टेंट रोल टू प्ले in the market logic of exclusion of the significant proportion of the people and particularly poor. It was necessary for the state to ensure the inclusion of such people in the economic sphere. Because we already got a market economy tendency to exclude the people, both as a consumer and also as a producer. I'm just discussed the market economy excludes these people. But the state to include and state must ensure the inclusion of such people, those who are being excluded by market economy, and to put them in rights or give them a right space in the economic sphere. देखो कितने crucial गोटे state role हिसाब. So as the colonial past and the nationalistic projects say above the strategy of economic development, conscious efforts they were made to limit the degree of the openness and of development. So clearly speaking, it was a departure from the colonial era, which was marked with open market, unregulated market. So what are the objectives? The Main inputs were the lead role of the public investment, industrialization, which are based on substitution. Then the emphasis was on the capital goods sector. The emphasis was on industrial licensing to guide the investment in the private sector. And the large doses of public investment created a physical infrastructure and helped in setting off the intermediate goods industries. Due to its legacy of leading an anti-colonial struggle based on the core principles of nationalism and development, Congress became the ruling dominant party. There was a political consensus that industrialization meant development and national interest was to be equated with people's interest. The foreign capitalists, even the indigenous zamindars of our country, they were excluded from the political economy of development. Land reforms measures, they could not be implemented as a lower level of bureaucracy. Those are in alliance with the local landed politicians. They lobby obstructing these land reforms. Initially speaking, land reform measures successfully implemented. So, legislation glaring loopholes रहिला जोटा कि properly ई प्रकार problem को solution दे पारा नहीं. The net result was that the owners turned into cultivation, community development programs, panchayat raj system, social legislation including reservation in the educational institutions and employment. They were gradually introduced with the advancement of time. And during the period of 1967 to 1990, the trend of political democracy and economic development was slightly different from that of the previous period. Prior to 1967, the consensus between democracy and development, it was broken. Because there is a qualitative change which took place in interaction between politics of democracy and economics welfareism. The very social groups who were on the margin of the society and were lying dormant, they became empowered gradually. The social group dormant gradually they have been empowered. They now started making economic claims on the state. They now started making those claims which are successfully mediated between the politics and economics of the Indian democracy. So the ensuing process of mediation or reconciliation on the part of the Indian state had long-term economic and political consequences. And also, the very consensus about the nature of democracy and development also was broken for other reasons. because the second generation of political leadership which emerged in the aftermath of the Kamraj plan. First generation जो मैंने धरते Indian independence struggle रे जड़ित थिले, freedom struggle कले, freedom को आनिले. After that, the second generation of the politicians they have come up, particularly Kamraj plan. Those who are acquainted with a bit with that Kamraj plan. This second generation of this leadership, they are devoid of legitimacy, acceptance and charisma of the nationalistic leadership. And also during this phase after 1967, regionalization, ruralization of Indian politics they took place. And 1967 ପରେ ଆପଣ ଗୋଟେ political scenario ରେ important trend ହେଉଛି Congress dominance has broken. जो कांग्रेस monolithic structure थिला 1967 ର general election रे ता भांगिला. अनेक regional parties तांकर विभिन्न state रे election रे victorious हेले. So Congress was no longer a dominant party after 1967. So Jogendra Jadhav, से तांकर a second democratic upsurge took place in the form of a fundamental transformation in the terrain of politics, which in turn is anchored in the process of social change. এবং শেষ সময় দেখবে dominant caste rich peasantry धीरे धीरे मुंड टेका को आरंभ कले. Like Jat माने Kamaj, Tapus, Yadavs, Reddys, Reddys, Kamaj, Yadavs, these are all rich peasantry. Se mane dhire dhire munda tikle. In the place of decline of semi-feudal landlords. And each caste group dhire dhire munda tikle, they have deserted the Congress to join or create opposition parties. एमे अन्य पार्टी क्रिएट करके अन्य ऑपोजिशन पार्टी मान धीरे धीरे जॉइन कले. So the newly entrant class of the rich peasantry, semane they have their own preponderant influence in politics and they have asked for their due share of benefit derived from the economic policies of the state. And also they strive to have an upward movement in the political process. There is upper ko uthibar se political process re to attempt tanka bhitere asla. So what is the state response to this trend? The response of the state was in form of a strong new emphasis on agriculture in the form of green revolution. Thus for achieving food security, betting on the strong policy was adopted under the policy for the better endowed peasants. Though the land reform measures that had received partial success, with the notable exceptions of states like Kerala, West Bengal, Maharashtra, J&K, they are now no more pursued in other states. Then the poverty alleviation programs like DPAP or DOCRA, they are launched gradually. So in the absence of the serious programmatic efforts, the Congress under the leadership of Indira Gandhi increasingly restored to the populist measures rhetoric in the form of sloganing, nationalization of banks, abolition of privy purse. जोटा कि इंदिरा गांधी समय हेतला विशेष करी अनेक सोशलिस्टिक मेजर्स दे देने आला. बैंक नेशनलाइजेशन तांके समय बहुत इंपोर्टेंट थी. abolition of privy purse जो समय राजा महाराजा माने तांकर राजा समय ब्रिटिश कहिकरी ब्रिटिश को ठारू से प्रिवी पर्स तार प्रोटेक्शन रखिथिले हाथ पांठी सेटा को उच्छेद कर दिया गला. These are all populist measures, please remember. And during Indira's period, these particular measures have been taken, and they also received a lot of public support. Bank nationalization, abolition of reapers, and regionalism of dissent in the Congress. It was made by strategy of divide and rule by the High Command of the ruling Congress. Congress आर आउ थे डोमिनेंस टाको आनिया पाई ए मेजर्स गुड़ाक धीरे धीरे नेला. And in spite of that, there is a victory of Janata Party. कारण इंदिरा समय जो emergency हला, during that particular trend of emergency has really boomerang. And the victory of Janata Party not only reflected the sagacity of the Indian electors, voters, it also proved conclusively that democratic spirit had embedded in the political imagination of the Indian people. This is correct. After the emergency, there is a big decline of the Congress bastion. But Janata Party victory बहुत कम दिन तिष्ठि रहिला. It was short-lived. And the failure of Janata Party government reflected the limitations of the coalition politics. Which is devoid of ideological unity and purpose. Virtually, Congress dominance for immediately after the governments are mostly coalition governments. Because semango bhitere but partnership those of form the government have they are devoid of ideological unity and purpose. There is a failure of the government. So the return of a much chastened and insecure Indira Gandhi also saw the return of the politics of populism and patronage. The centralization of political power, politics of nomination, marketization of all polity, they all continue to remain the features of this period between 1980 to 1990. But after 1991 onwards, post 1991, India experienced the absence of a consensus regarding the strategy of economic development. The long-term vision of political leadership of Nehru, it has been replaced by a short-term strategy through the adoption of the new economic policy, NEP. Those are the policies of liberalization. And the emergent politics of empowerment, seemingly they move the economy and polity in opposite directions. Subtle significant feature है the unwillingness of the Indian state to mediate in order to effect the conflict resolutions. The political economists like Jayati Ghosh, Pranab Bardhan, Amit Bhaduri, and Deepak Nair, they have referred to some sort of a combination of the national and international factors which explain the shift of a crisis-driven and not a strategy-driven change in the economic politics of the Indian state. ଆପଣ ଦେଖିବେ ସେ ସମୟରେ ଗୋଟେ important international event ହେଉଛି collapse of the Soviet Union. USSR disintegrated. And also collapse of the communist regimes in the East European countries. It has an impact because those communist countries were the biggest trading partners of India. That is why their collapse has impacted our economy. The external debt crisis resulted in the short-term loans taken by Rajiv Gandhi administration, and those loans could not be returned because of the failure of the capital goods sector to export. So many such international events, they have impacted our political economy. Other factors like certain conditionalities which are imposed from above by the international monetary institutions like IMF means International Monetary Fund, World Bank. So the questions were raised that do you have a future of economic reforms in India? Then what are its implications for the democracy and development in India? It is very clear that the political instability in the present coalition era with frequent elections, they explain the prevalence of the short-term interest-driven politics. Instead of taking hard measures to stabilize the economy and risking the adverse electoral verdict, winning popular support in the elections, there is a continuation of the populist measures, and it has become a dominant factor in the policy making. And most of the investments, as one of our ODI economist, Prabhat Patnaik, he has also given the opinion that most of the investments is in the form of hot money. Hot money means the money which sits for quick returns. Quick return dabo. Those are hot money. So the rich state and poor state syndrome is also posing a challenge to Indian federal democracy. So the withdrawal of the state from the social sector has been hitting the poor people, as the whole notion of welfareism has come under question. There are many challenges to the success of policies of economic reform. The Gandhian values, which are having the influence over the masses now, they are opposed now to the market economy, as they emphasize on the groups than the individual interest. Profit making was not appreciated. So the neoliberal projects of development based on the process of liberalization, privatization, globalization. Because देखो से 90s रे another important event has happened, that's globalization. जो समरे there is a withdrawal of the state so far as the economic sphere is concerned, allowing the foreign investment to get in. So it was a period experiencing LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. But now this processes of LPG, it has come to be questioned by the advocates of sustainable development, even environmental preservation sphere. advocates thile. They have challenged this process of LPG, and also the new social movements. They have questioned it, the rationale of the prosperity of some of the social groups at the cost of others. The majority. So, to conclude, the economics of liberalization, the politics of empowerment, they are going in opposite direction. India, in contemporary India, you know, the willingness and ability of the Indian state, as in the past, to play the role of the mediation, is no more there. It fails to mediate. In such a situation, there is a critical need to emphasize the role of the civil society and its citizens for the politics of the common good and common rights. So it is imperative that the Indian state should adopt a strategic selective globalization that can enrich the very pluralistic character of the Indian democracy. You know, another important feature which has been associated with the Indian democratic structure is equality based on caste and class. Social inequality is always there. Virtually, it is an ubiquitous feature. Long back, the philosopher Rousseau has made a distinction between natural and social inequality. The natural inequality emerges from the unequal division of physical and mental abilities. But the social inequality arises from the social entitlements of the people to wealth and economic resources or political power and status, regardless of the potential abilities possessed by the individual. You know, Rousseau has made a distinction between the natural and the social inequality. Natural, for example, somebody less intelligent, the other is more intelligent. It is a natural inequality. But even if you are intelligent, by social structures, if your access is restricted, then you cannot earn your livelihood. You cannot have access to the economic resources. You cannot have political power. Even if you are endowed with natural endowments. And this is what is called social inequality. କାରଣ social structure ଟା ସେ ସମୟରେ ଗୋଟେ ନିର୍ଦ୍ଦିଷ୍ଟ individual କୁ prevent କରୁଛି so far as his access to this economic and political opportunities are concerned. He could not avail of it. You know, probably in the Indian traditional society, caste is the most contentious issue. ତେଣୁ French scholar ତାଙ୍କର ଫେମସ୍ ଗୋଟେ ୱାର୍କ କାଷ୍ଟ ଉପରେ କରିଥିଲେ ସେ ଫେମସ୍ ଫିଲୋସଫର ଅଛନ୍ତି ଲୁଇ ଡୁମା that is homo hierarchicus. You know, in this image, two opposing conceptual categories of purity and pollution are the core elements of caste structure in India. There are certain values which separate the Indians culturally from the Western civilization, making India a land of static, unchangeable, oriental, Brahminical values. And mark karibe, caste structure or caste hierarchy in India virtually was a very close system. This notion of caste has been challenged by Nicholas Dark and others. Dumont's notion was criticized as it failed to explain the social change of dynamism and individualistic strivings, even with the traditional Indian society. କାରଣ ଯେଉଁମାନେ ଏଇଟା ଗୋଟେ static hierarchical structure ହିସାବରେ ଗ୍ରହଣ କରୁଥିଲେ, that notion has been nullified. You think in terms of the opinion of the sociologists, those like M.N. Srinivas and others, those who have also given the element of mobility in the caste structure by saying that most the social customs of the upper caste people have been practiced by the members of the lower caste groups. By that way, they are not able to change the caste identity, but by that way, they can have certain grabbings over the social opportunities of the system. So, by that way, there is some upward mobility. Caste identification तो द्वारा change है नहीं, किंतु social opportunities को ସେମାନେ धीरे-धीरे they have the access towards these social opportunities. You know, the simplistic structures like Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Sudras, and Vaishyas, the very Varna system, or what is called the caste-based scripture Brahminical model of traditional India, was an invention of the British Orientalists, ethnographers. But caste definitely has played a very dominant role in Indian politics. With आपने बहुत बड़ी even Rajni Kotari's books you shall find caste politics in India. Dominant caste, a particular society plays a very important role in the electoral victory of a particular party or a particular member of society. So, it's a very curious trend that most of the political parties they try to field the candidates during the election, and those candidates are picked up from the dominant caste of that particular region, because caste appeal is a very emotive appeal, and by this emotional appeal there is a possibility of victory for the political party. You know, ସେମାନେ ଗୋଟେ dominant caste ର member କୁ ସେମାନଙ୍କର election ରେ field କରିବାକୁ ଚାହାନ୍ତି. So caste politics in India has become a very preponderant trend. रजनी कोठारी आपने बहुत किसी तांकर गवेषणा କରିଛନ୍ତି. So, you know, there are two opposing views. Some view it as an unchanged survival of Brahminical tradition. अनेक मते caste को चुट unchanged survival of the Brahminical tradition. And according to this view, Brahmanism represents a core civilization value and caste is the central symbol of this value. And this is a basic expression of the pre-colonial tradition of India. But contrary to this view, some other scholars like Nicholas Dark, the castes of mind in 2001, he argues that caste is a product of colonial modernity. By this, he does not mean that caste did not exist before the advent of the British. He is simply suggesting that caste became a single, unique category under the British rule, which expressed and provided the sole index of understanding India. So these are two views regarding the caste tradition of India in the colonial context of the colonial modernity. The very attempt to either downplay or dismiss the significance of Brahminism or Brahminical order is not in accordance with the familiar historical records. Caste terms and principles definitely are not in universal use in pre-colonial period. Caste in various names, forms, and manifestations was also not an immutable entity. Starting from the Vedas, the great epics, from Manu to Dharmasastras, from Pranas, from many ritualistic practices, the penal system of the Peshwa rulers and other Dharmasastras, those who punish culprits according to the caste principle, to the denunciation of the anti-Brahminical reformers. And caste was also a fabrication of the British rulers designed to demean and subjugate the Indians. It did serve the colonial interest by condemning it. Brahminical tyranny, the colonial administration could easily justify their course to civilize and improve the colonial people. So, this is a brief trend of the caste identity in case of the Indian, in the traditional Indian society. Which is also class societies are characterized by the horizontal division of the society. देखो कास्ट और क्लास से जोड़ा कहूँ दी प्रकार जोड़े पैरामीटर सोशल डिवीजन रे सोशल स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन रो जोड़े इंपोर्टेंट पैरामीटर होची कास्ट और होची क्लास एक्चुअली क्लास सिस्टम का बेसी मार्क्सिस्ट लिटरेचर रे पॉपुलर हेतिला इट वाज नॉट इन केस ऑफ द इंडियन ट्रेडिशन एंड ऑल दैट in Marxist terms classes are defined by the different access to the means of production आम्ही जोटा की पढ़ी बुर्जुआ and proletariat, the people having the means of production with them and those who are not having any control over the means of production. And what constitutes the dominant proprietary class in the urban areas is marked by the plurality and heterogeneity in its composition. The class composition in the rural areas, they also bear the stamp of colonialism. The older group of the rural gentry, they were retained and transferred into a kind of rentier class of the landlords. And particularly, this is true of the permanently settled zamindars. And our Indian society of the class conflict আছে এই জমিদারি সিস্টেম ইন্টারমিডিয়েট সিস্টেম মৌজাদারি সিস্টেম আছে তালুকদারি সিস্টেম আছে so settled zamindar areas like Bengal and talukdar areas of Awadh and these landowners rentiers class generally emerged from the pre-existing groups of zamindars and talukdars who had enjoyed the rights of revenue collection under the British regimes. Pre-British regime dominance. And they exercised extra economic and feudal coercion over the small marginalized sharecroppers. The rich farmers, however, are numerically the most important proprietor class in rural areas. And in the areas outside the Jamindari settled areas of Bengal, the colonial state settled land revenue with the dominant cultivating groups. So a class of rich farmers emerged from these groups. And they took advantage of the expanding market networks under the colonial economy. And the other thing is, caste देखो तामने virtually caste is a very indigenous structure of Indian society. Class concept of Martian literature रे आदृत कि नाम Indian society रे this particular concept of class come up with this zamindari system, talukdari system, and all that, with the emergence of rich farmers. Another thing is the bureaucratic managerial elite also constitutes significant class in India, because the growth of non-market mechanism and planning and allocation of resources and economic patronage, they resulted in the expansion of bureaucracy. This class expanded in the post-colonial phase. The command ए जो bureaucracy जो नुआ official dom टा create हैला सेमाने मध्य गोटे निर्दिष्ट class रे इसको identify कले. The command have command over knowledge, skills, tests, network, and relationship. They are notable features of this class. They have more of say access to the knowledge, skills, tests, networks of relationships, and all that. जो मैंने गोटे upper elite class plus section हिसाब से गणित है. Caste and class, both of them they point towards the inequality of the hierarchical section of India. Caste hierarchy कौन तो class hierarchy कौन तो? They speak in terms of inequalities. Hierarchy अर्थ कौन? Upper lower, जोटा कि गोटे scalar base रे arranged है. In both the cases of caste and class, however, the principle of organization differs. Core feature of caste is endogamy, marriage within the caste, occupational differentiation, hereditary specialization of occupation, etc. अपन देखो तो caste group रे गोटे कौलिक प्रथा. A Brahmin's child shall take up the jobs which his father was taking up, like Jajmani or Purohit. Likewise, a Kshatriya son will take up the job of his father. Same the endogamy. Marriage was very restricted within the caste group, members of the caste group only. So it was a closed system. Now, how does caste and class overrelate? Class of caste with a relationship account. Classes are subdivided in terms of types of ownership and control of the economic resources and the types of services contributed to the process of production in society. The Brahminical ritual hierarchy of caste is also not universally applicable. They are upheld by all. In many cases, ritual hierarchy is only contextual. The prosperous Jat in North India enjoys social and political dominance without equivalent ritual status. So, sometimes it may so happen that the class taking the caste को मध्य interfere करूँगी. That the member of the rich class person tries to have a relationship with the rich of another caste group, irrespective of the fact that the other fellow belongs to a lower caste. Class-wise, he is rich. So, a rich caste member can have a relationship with a rich member of a rich class. So sometimes, however, caste works as a discrete community without any hierarchical relationship to other segments of the society. Caste or class, they resemble in certain aspects and they also differ in some other aspects. Although there is considerable divergence between the hierarchy of caste, that of the class, the top and bottom segments of the caste system are largely subsumed under the caste structure. You see, the upper caste's own means of production, land in rural areas, they act as rentiers. The landless agrarian proletarian coincide with the lower castes or the Dalits who provide the labor services. Rich caste means landowner. So they belong to the rich class. Kintu tanko land jo mane kaam kale, those who put the labor, the laborer class, they belong to the Dalit class. Virtually lower caste group members. देखो class of caste ର କେମିତି interrelations ହଉଛି rural background ରେ. So the landless agrarian proletarian coincide with the lower caste of Dalits who provide labor services for the rentier upper caste groups, as well as rich, prosperous farmers of intermediary level. So, if social inequalities, these are all social inequalities. It may be on the parameter can be used. It may be class inequality. It may be caste inequality. They're so deeply entrenched. Then how do we affect the development process and participation? That is the question. This key question can be answered in many ways. For example, Kothari, while analyzing the intrusion of caste into politics, Rajini Kothari, agar caste politics India is one of the best works. Then how caste has a preponderant influence on the voting patterns, the voting behavior of people. So, while analyzing this intrusion of the caste into politics and politics into the caste, ଦେଖନ୍ତୁ ଦିଟାକ inter and mutually affecting each other. There is politicization of caste also. So politics are entered into caste structure. Caste is no more just a social division, and also caste has interfered with the politics. So while analyzing this intrusion of caste into politics and politics into caste, he distinguishes three stages in the progression of political modernization after independence. In the first stage, he says that the struggle for political power was limited to the entrust and the ancient castes. ତେଣୁ ପ୍ରଥମ ସ୍ଟେଜରେ ସେ କହିଛନ୍ତି political power was limited to the entrance and the ascendant castes. The castes. In the second phase, competitions within these castes for power led to factionalism, and in the third stage, lower castes have been mobilized and are asserting themselves in the political domain. So, inside of the egalitarian ideal of post-colonial Indian state, there are still disproportionate access to resources, power, and entitlements between the different social bases, social classes, and between various social castes also. The establishment of a formal democracy in itself is no guarantee that all citizens will enjoy equal access and participation in the political process. The political privileges are retained and ingrained in many non-elective institutions, civil bureaucracy, and the police in particular. And they protect the interests of the dominant proprietary class and also the upper castes. So, the post-colonial state in India accepted the formal principles of equality and social justice in governance. However, no social entity exists in a vacuum. The functioning of our democratic polity is profoundly and unfairly influenced by the caste and class-based inequalities. ଯେତେ ମଧ୍ୟ constitutional arrangement ଥିଲେ ମଧ୍ୟ inequalities so far as caste and class is concerned, they prevail. And the disadvantages, societyର ଯୋଉମାନେ disadvantaged groups, it may be on the basis of class or caste, they are victims of both the naked and subtle forms of deprivation and the naked forms of discrimination that continues in spite of all the formal arrangements in the post-colonial democratic society. And another important point of discussion is our political economic development, which is in short called PED. You know, India was, prior to independence, a richly endowed subcontinent, and overwhelmingly large part of its people, they live a life of extreme poverty. Though there is a very small minority which enjoys standard living at par with the highest in the world. Poverty, unemployment, disease, squalor, frequent disasters, crime, and vast inequalities are openly visible, but they vary widely in different parts of the spaceship, including India. Though no part of the globe is entirely free from this problem, in over two-thirds of the world, billions of the human beings constitute the global majority, face this grim reality, this grim threat. The problems, they are very acute, and they can be considered the defining main characteristics of hundreds of the countries, including India. So there is a lot of statistics about these vast disparities, which is very much rampant in our country. And those statistics are also very authoritatively available. And for one thing, agriculture continues to remain the main source of livelihood for nearly two-thirds of the majority, of Indian population. And statistics says that the share of the agriculture in GDP, it has dwindled from about three-fifths of the total at the time of independence to the little below a quarter presently. At the same time, per capita net sown area has sunk to 0.13 hectare, which is mere one third of what it was in 1947, just at the time of independence. Thus, despite the Amar Bhudan movement, land reforms, legal administrative attempt to redistribute the land between the rich and the poor. I mean, fair distribution of land between the rich and poor. सब प्रकार attempt by Bhudan movement, बिनोवा जी को leadership रे land reform measures ने In spite of that, the concentration of the land holdings has increased to such an extent that broadly speaking, it may be said that the top 20% of the landholders control roughly 80% of the cultivable area. So, likewise, also we can have this of the income comparisons. The estimated income levels differentials, they do not fully capture the socio-economic conditions of the existence of the people. For one thing, income is related to market-centric activities. But many critical and important activities, including those connected with material aspects and bearing and well-being social role, and esteem that non-market activities and they involve family, community, state, civil society, and organizations. The market-generated income conceals its hidden as well as non-monetary costs. Market-generated income-based comparisons take a highly limited and truncated view or a narrow view of the life, society, and future. And the market tends to be highly narrow and myopic. Income flows may be generated by producers regularly on an ad hoc basis, and they can be made available by means of a transfer, even with a guaranteed measure of regularity in many different ways. But in this process, those who disperse income from, to dominate and to the recipients get dominated and subordinated. And this involves the income transfer recipients in an unequal relationship of disempowerment and dependence, making them feel and explicitly forcing on them a feeling of inferiority. So the main features of the global social, economic, and political cultural divide, which constitute the problematic of the political economy of development. Of course, the internal differentiation and inequalities of a country, they are related to the persistent and growing international inequality, and they form a major component of the development discourse in our country. The GDP in various forms is not only an overly quantified indicator, it is also a highly imperfect, imprecise, incomplete, biased, and misleading indicator. It basically it camouflages the interest of the big international capital dominating the rich industrialized countries, and this is because the process of capital accumulation, industrialization, along with the consequential social relationship and also international relations, lifestyles, technology, marketization, which are based on cultural products, and the symbols are derived from or related to them, many further the interest and power of those who are commanding this process of capital accumulation and industrialization. So, by this process, they exclude and marginalize a much larger number of population. The Indian experience of modern industrialization, both during the colonial period and in the post-independent era, they clearly show that share of industry in both the GDP and in the workforce, there remains a small fraction, not only of the age-old agriculture, but also of the rapid expanding services sector. So one can see that why there are powerful forces raised in support of the perpetuation of the national income as the indicator of development and economic growth, as the most important objective and the essence and definition of economic development. Many studies by perceptive social scientists, as also a number of official documents, especially those coming from the Planning Commission, they recognize that this analysis are fully correct for India. The 10th five-year plan clearly states there are several aspects of development where progress has been clearly disappointing. Growth in the 1990s has generated less employment than was expected. The infant mortality rate has stagnated at around 70 1,000 for several years. As many as 60% of the rural households and about 20% of the urban households, they do not have a power connection. Only 60% of the urban households have access to drinking water in their houses, and far fewer have latrines inside their houses. So the situation is, this regard is much worse in the rural areas. So this is the observation of the 10th five-year plan. Of course, similar conditions they also prevail over much in Africa, Asia, and other Latin American countries, where the majority of the world population they live. So there is the agenda for political economy of development. What about the, I think, because it's a very large discussion, complicated discussion, what about the role of the state? You know, the role of capital accumulation and international capital movement, it hopes to have so many limitations. True, the production must increase, and for this purpose, generally capital accumulation is needed, especially when other factors of productions are available. But this is a means to numerous higher ends and has to the result of changes in socio-economic institutional structures prevalent in the poor countries, which obstacles which threatens towards the development of micro and macro levels. So the PD critic, I mean, political economy of development, the critic of the conventional development economies, they goes beyond this a critical examination of the policy variable of capital accumulation. It is true that until the counter revolution of development economies in the first half of 1970s, there was little difference of opinion concerning the key and leading analysis. Catalytic entrepreneurial role of the state in energizing, directing, and even directly conducting the processes of capital accumulation or the process of industrialization and economic growth, along with satisfying some societal welfare concerns. So, within the broad parameter of active statist development, policy, there were, of course, differences of emphasis, nuances, choice of agencies, instruments, and organizational forms, durability and statist interventions, and their relationship with various domestic and external social economic groups. So, what is the post colonial wars? The post colonial wars for self reliance and striving for relatively independent place in the Committee of the Nations, too had few exceptions. In the societies where the state was among the relatively advanced and better organized institutions within the constituents exposed to the historical experience of early industrialization, the state directed and commanded processes of accumulation and successfully created other alternative foci of power and capability, especially in countries with restrictive approach towards the foreign direct investment (FDI). So, pointing to the global divide between the rich and the poor, both developed and developing countries And the fact that growth and income levels are not necessarily an indication of an increase. We have discussed that the political economy of development and some of the important political economy theories of development and its applicability, especially with regard to India. Income cannot be made the only development factor, which seems to be the result of the monopolization of development issues, especially as it evolved in the rich countries. The limitations and capital accumulation and FDI inflows as a means of growth. The LPG, that is liberalization, privatization, globalization package, it's suggested by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for bailing the poor and weak economies out of the crisis. It resulted in big retreat of the state. And a political economy approach cannot stand for a development paradigm which restricts people's free choice, and it cannot have a predetermined universal. You know, there has been a marked structural transformation of the Indian economy in the 1990s vis-a-vis that of 1980s. The intersectoral composition of the gross domestic product, it underwent a significant change after the initiation of a reform process in 1991. The services sector has come to occupy a place of prominence in terms of relative contribution to GDP. There is considerable variation in the performance of the individual states, faster than the average, and the others slower. Some states they grow faster, some states they grow slower. The degree of dispersion in growth rates across states increased very significantly in 1990s. The range of variation in growth rate of state domestic product in 1980s was from a low of 3 point, it is just mere 6% per year in Kerala to a high of 6.6% in Rajasthan, a factor of less than 2. So in the 1990s, the variation was much larger than a low of 2.7% per year for Bihar to a high of 9.6% per year for Gujarat, a factor which is exceeding 3.5. Just statistics. So the differences in performance across the states become even more marked when we allow for differences in rates of growth of population and evaluate the performance in terms of growth rates of per capita SDP. The increased variation in the growth performance across the states in 1990s reflect the fact that whereas growth accelerated for the economy as a whole is actually decelerated. It has not accelerated, it has decelerated sharply in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Odisha, all of which had relatively low rates of growth to begin with and were also the poorest states. There was also deceleration in Haryana and Punjab, but the deceleration was from relatively higher levels of growth in 1980s, and these states were also the richest. Another important issue is how to define poverty and poverty line. So, primarily influenced by the research work in India, the World Bank defined absolute poverty as the bottom 40% of the population in developing countries. The first absolute definition of poverty was that of the Dandekar Rath, who defined it as the expenditure of rupees 15 per capita per month for the Indian rural population at 1960-61. Kaku poor boli ami koiba definition. And rupees 18 per capita per month for the urban population. For 16 for the rural population and 80 for the urban population. The government of India set up the expert group to suggest a methodology to measure poverty. And the group submitted the report in 1993 and suggested a new poverty line of rupees 49 and 56 for rural and urban areas. जोटा आगु तमरो दांडे रथ कमिटी कहितला rupees 15 per month for Indian rural population, rupees 18 per capita per month for the urban population. It was a report of 1960-61. सेटा 73-74 जो एक्सपर्ट ग्रुप सेमानक सजेशन देले, they suggested a new poverty line. So it is 49 for urban, rural population, 56 for the urban areas. So it differs actually from time to time. So most widely used measure of poverty in India is the head count ratio, HCR तक कहा जाए, जहाँ माध्यम से तुम्हें poverty line को तुम्हें measure करियो. So that is the most widely used measure of poverty. That is called, please remember, head count ratio. These are all statistical information just to remember. So this is a measure of income poverty. In the early 1960s, the government of India appointed a special working group of eminent economists to assess the level of poverty in India. The experts came up with a definition of the poverty line. This was based on a nationally desirable minimum standard balanced diet prescribed by the Nutrition Act. The Nutrition Advisory Committee. In other words, any family who could not afford to buy a rudimentary food basket. Please remember, I am poor koiba. A particular family who could not even buy a rudimentary food basket, which when consumed yielded a minimum level of calories, was considered poor. So they declared that 50% of Indians lived below poverty line. You know, Nutrition Advisory Committee, tankar जो report से कहते हैं family जी गोटे rudimentary food basket को मध्य purchase करने को afford करी पारुनी. They can turn 50% of the population, Indian population, they are below poverty line according to their statistics. So, however, a poverty line thus defined is something of a destitution line, since it takes into account only the expenditure required for subsistence, for food, leaving out everything else. The subsistence को मध्य से मैंने meet करी पारुनानी. So, differences in methodology and assumptions can lead to quite different estimates. विभिन्न समय विभिन्न प्रकार मेथड एस्टिमेशन मेजर्स को अप्लाई कराई छि पॉवर्टी लाइन को डिफाइन करे पाए. So the head count ratio जोटा कि just हमें रेफर कले, which is a widely used measure for poverty line, HCR. This ratio is computed on the basis of NSS. NSS रो डाटा उपरे डाटा ऑन कंजम्पशन एक्सपेंडिचर तार पर बेस करके हेड काउंट रेशियो को कंप्यूट करा होगा. NSS, that is National Statistical Survey. So this at various points of time, this has been defined differently. So there are various trends in this poverty ratio. Between 1951 to mid 1970s, income poverty reduction shown no discernible trend. In 1951, 47% of India's rural population was below the poverty line. Then the proportion went up to 64% in 1954-55, like that. Then there is also statistics between 1970s and 80s. Then after 1991. So the difference in growth performance of the individual states. Also, you shall find that the tables have been given by the reporting agencies and all that. They have important implications for poverty reduction, which is a critical objective of the national policy. You know, somebody national policy wrote a critical objective how to reduce this poverty and all that. The only available estimate of poverty in individual states were those derived from the uh, so-called large sample survey. So this is a national sample survey. NSS means national sample survey. There are just statistical data. So they have conveyed about 1,20,000 households, which are conducted by the NSS, NSS National Sample Survey, every 5 years. And the NSS also conducts annual surveys, but the sample sizes is too small to provide reliable estimates. In the sample size is so small that the conclusions drawn by them cannot be reliable and all that. Okay, these are all their statistics and all that. So the objective of India's development strategy is the eradication of mass poverty. I mean, our सबुबले तार अर्थ objective होची how to reduce poverty and all that. So there is a clear association between the rapid growth and poverty alleviation. Poverty in India is largely a rural phenomenon, and there are more than 80% of India's poor lives in rural areas. Thus, for reform to have a substantial impact, it has to extend to rural areas. Income levels alone should not be a measure of poverty, as they often fail to capture other dimensions of human life. So there can be other deprivations like child labor, malnutrition, illiteracy, prostitution, caste discrimination. They are not related to income poverty levels in any predictable manner. So the levels of affluence are not a measure of poverty of human lives. So India needs to strike a balance in its development, in its economic and social front, with the state playing a very, very proactive role in eradication of poverty from the society. I think these are most of the statistical things, and the surveys made by NSS, National Sample Survey, and all that. Uh, so this, I think, it is already time where. So today we have discussed some of the statistics, most of the economic statistics, and also PED, this political economy of development approach and all that. Uh, so with this, I uh, want to uh, close today's discussion, and also I thank all of you for your listening. So
Hello.
thank you. So now I am the
Sir,
platform.
voice clear
Thank
सुना
you.
जाऊन ଟିକେ ଆଜି।
से बड़े बड़े कौन पता कनेक्ट नेट प्रॉब्लम होता है पारे ठीक है ओके वी शैल ट्राई टू connect to some other device tomorrow. Okay. आज तो 17 बजने हमें लास्ट को किसी किसी क्वेश्चन डिस्कस कर दो ओके हेलो in some other time some other classes we shall discuss some of the possible model type of questions and all that okay because today it is already 7 o'clock and master 2 घंटा is a very tiresome journey all that but in some other class I shall definitely go for the discussion and some of the model questions and all that okay thank you for your patient listening
Thank you, sir.
thank you very much thank you
Voice clear सुना जा। Hello.